Right, welcome back. So you see the way in which this conversation's unfolding, right? I'm expecting that now that you've all had your favorite drugs, it could potentially get even more lively. I'm not supposed to mention the word drugs in Japan, somebody said? No? I'm talking caffeine, nicotine, sugar, whatever you want. Okay. So look, in the morning, we kind of framed the agenda, right? Said, even though a lot of the conversation was about Japanese organizations, the framing of the agenda was, what is globalization doing to people? How are people reacting? Now, here, to talk about one particular aspect of that reaction, thinking about diversity, is our next panel. Now, at INSEAD, we've been researching this issue from multiple perspectives for a long time, right? We'll try and put this into perspective after this particular panel, but let me just introduce the members of the panel. It gives me very great pleasure to introduce as your moderator, Sadia Khan, and also on the panel are Masako Egawa, Lim Chui Fun, Hideyuki Onishi-san, and Sandeep Sander. Let me turn this over to Sadia.
Thank you, Narayan. Is this working? Yep. Well, good morning, everyone. I hope you've had your shots of coffee. I can see a few still indulging. But don't worry if you didn't get a cup, because this discussion is going to be so stimulating that you will not need any more caffeine for the rest of the day. Given the topic of diversity, we're also going to have a very diverse discussion. I'm delighted to note already that this is a diverse panel as forums and conferences go. 3 out of 5 is not bad for gender diversity, at least. So kudos to the organizers. We're going to do a short round of self-introductions, and it's not about career paths that we want to talk about, but really our own personal development, which have shaped our thoughts on diversity. So starting with myself, I grew up in Karachi, Pakistan, which unfortunately is in the news for all the wrong reasons these days. I was brought up a Muslim, but educated at the Convent of Jesus and Mary, a missionary school set up a century ago. I then went on to England to study as an undergraduate, spent 3 years trying to avoid picking up a British accent. Unfortunately, didn't succeed. Went on to the United States of America for 5 years, first as a graduate student, and then took up my first job in Manhattan. And for those of you who have experienced American life will know that it's very easy to assimilate into that culture. Manhattan especially is a big melting pot. And then I went to INSEAD, and I realized there was no melting pot. There were over 70 nationalities represented in that one promotion, and I had no choice but to be me. And that's when I learned how to leverage my own diversity for my career path in the choices I made, in the opportunities I took up. Earlier this year, I was elected the president of one of the most unique alumni associations of the world. And if anybody is wondering how that happened, including myself, focus on the benefits of diversity, which this panel is going to be talking about. So that's all about me. I'm going to hand it over to each one of our panelists for a short self-introduction and their thoughts on diversity. Masako.
Thank you, Sadia. I'm Masako Egawa from Japan, but I also spent about 5 or 6 years outside Japan, living in the United States. So when I was a high school student, I spent a year in California being a foreign exchange student. And then after graduating from University of Tokyo in 1980, I started to work for financial institutions, but non-Japanese companies. So I actually spent about 20 years working for American and British firm in the investment banking industry, and worked both in New York and Tokyo. And during that time, I also went to Harvard Business School, went to the wrong business school. But that also gave me opportunity to really get to know people around the world. And then when in 2001, Harvard asked me to launch Japan Research Center. And I studied I conducted research on Japanese companies and developed cases, working very closely with the HBS professors. And then that actually gave me entry into academic world. So I have an unusual background of combining business and academic career. In 2009, I was asked by my alma mater, University of Tokyo, to join the university as executive vice president. And I was the first female executive vice president. And I worked closely with the president and 6 other executive vice presidents, and one of my responsibility was really international affairs. So I really had to, this was not only the first time to really encounter Japanese organization, and you can imagine how Japanese the University of Tokyo was, but also bringing in diversity, both non-Japanese faculty and students, as well as female gender diversity was a big challenge. And then this March, I stepped down from this position after completing 6-year term, and recently I joined Hitotsubashi University. So even though I have different jobs along the 35 years, I've always been a bridge between Japan and overseas. So I like to bring in a perspective.
Thank you very much. I like to beat you in terms of when it started. I'm born diverse. My father is from India. My mother was from Denmark. No one is perfect. And we now live in Singapore. And so far, we've been working in 42 countries. I started my first company when I was 25. But I want to highlight something that happened 30 years ago. That was when I was at INSEAD. And I met my very dear friend Yoshi, who's also here today. Yoshi, do you mind standing up? 30 years of friendship. We were at INSEAD together. So I think that I'll pass on the microphone and then we can get on with the discussions. But I look forward to contributing as best I can. I do a lot of work related to diversity.
Chifun.
Hello, I'm Chifun. I guess I grew up with diversity. I grew up in Malaysia, and for those who've been to Malaysia know it is a multicultural, multi-religion melting pot. And of course I went to INSEAD, and really, you think about the days at INSEAD, huddled around the cubicles, trying to desperately finish your group work, because we're trying to align the scientists and the artists. That takes diversity to a completely different dimension. And of course, post-INSEAD, I had a very international career. I lived half the time in Europe, managing a global business, and the other half in Asia-Pacific. So currently, I run the Asia-Pacific healthcare business for the Linde Group, and we are diverse. Over 15 countries, all with different, again, culture background and languages, but that's not it. I think the real challenge for business is not about maximizing the individual countries' markets, but I think the bigger prize for us really is about how, as leaders of the business, that you can really harness that potential, that richness of what you have to completely transform your business and take it to a completely different level. It's really about being great to extraordinary. And I think this is a challenge, for us today, for us to reflect and think about what you and I, as business leaders, can do. Because for me, diversity without leadership is a complete disaster. You get a homogeneous group of people together without a leader, they pretty much get by because they see the world the same way. They see the same path. When we have a room of people with completely different views of the world, without strong leadership, you get a completely dysfunctional environment. Thank you.
Onishi-san.
Yeah, this is Onishi. I started my career as a chemist in the American company with the aspiration to make the world a better place by chemistry. And then somehow I was assigned to the business world and I started to really like this field. My interaction with INSEAD, actually, my boss assigned me INSEAD for the short-term assignments. My name is Hideyuki Onishi. And the same boss actually assigned same person, Onishi Hideyuki, to the different business class. That time, Thunderbird. So Onishi Hideyuki Onishi, he didn't understand this family name and first name. So I just took advantage of attending those two different business class. And I really appreciate the diverse, let's say, participants, of course, but faculty and such from INSEAD. So that was my first contact with INSEAD. I joined GE 5 years ago, and 6 months after we have earthquake, we have a nuclear disaster and such and such. So since after we have a pretty dynamic business environment. But to survive in this very dynamic environment, really diversity pays off. So that's probably the angle that I can talk about diversity today.
Thank you all. So the structure of today's panel discussion is we're going to attempt to answer 4 questions. What is diversity in all its manifestations? How does it impact organization structure and behavior? What are the best practices that corporations can employ to enhance the level of diversity within the companies? And 4th, what role does leadership play in trying to leverage that level of diversity to the benefit of the corporation? One of the greatest reasons I like being a panelist and a moderator, it helps me to do research on topics that are hitherto I've just sort of experienced and not really thought about academically. So in preparing for this panel discussion, I came across a very interesting piece of research which defined the 5 dimensions of culture in different societies. And I think it's very relevant to know what these 5 dimensions are in the context of globalization. When companies go beyond their borders and experience different cultures and societies, they should know what are the different levels that those societies operate at. Now, these 5 elements, and I will use my speaking notes since I am not an academic specializing in this. Number 1 dimension, degree of inequality. And this really determines the level of hierarchy within the corporation. What kind of respect do the employees show to rank, to title, to position? The second aspect is the degree of risk-taking. Are people comfortable with the status quo? Do they like to stick to rules and regulations, and hence not really enjoy deviating from a chosen path? The third level is the degree of individualism versus the degree of collectivism. Are people individualistic in their needs and desires as opposed to working for the common good? The 4th element, very interesting in the local context, is the level of masculinity in the society. And here, whether the society sticks to certain roles for the genders, men being seen to be more assertive, more tougher, focused on material gain, women seem to be more modest, gentle, focused on the quality of life. Of course, there are many, including myself, who would differ on these descriptions. But it also shows that when a society is more masculine, they are more focused on the money, the status, the position, the power, and hence high levels of stress and high levels of competitiveness in the workplace as well. And I think we'll talk a little bit more about that in the panel discussion. And finally, the 5th element is long-term versus short-term. Are you focused on the long-term and hence the perseverance and the thrift factors that come into your decision-making? Or are you more focused on the short-term and hence the expectation of quick returns, high consumption, low savings? So these are the different elements that define a society, and different countries are at different levels along these 5 dimensions. Now, I'd like to pick up on one dimension, which is masculinity, because in this research, Japan ranked the highest on this particular dimension. The Nordic countries, Sandeep, the Nordic countries ranked the lowest. So I'm glad that we have both Masako and you talking about this particular issue. I'd like to invite Masako to shed some light on this particular issue of gender diversity in the Japanese context.
Okay. So first, I'd like to share the slide from World Economic Forum's Gender Gap Index ranking since 2006. And Japan has been basically very low scores. This year, 2015, Japan was 101 out of 145 countries. And Japan's scores are very low, especially because of the very low scores in economic, political empowerment and economic participation and opportunity. And because of that, the current administration is making a high priority to empower women and especially bring increase the women's labor force participation rate. As you can see, there's a big gap between women who wishes to work and who don't have a job. So actually, the OECD estimates if we close this gap, our GDP could increase 20%. And Goldman Sachs estimate is 13%. So there's actually a huge potential. And there's also a push to increase the women leaders. So encouraged by foreign investors who ask questions, where's no women on the board, as well as government encouragement, many Japanese companies are appointing female to directors on the board and corporate audit. And there's also a movement to improve the corporate governance to bring in more independent directors, which helps this cause. So you can see there's a sharp increase in the number of female directors as well as corporate auditors. But still, the overall is less than 3%. So the next slide shows the percentage of women in the leadership positions. We have currently 15% in the cabinet, represented at the cabinet ministers. But at the Diet members or parliament members, it's less than 10%. Prefectural governors, only 6%. Or managerial positions in the private companies, only 11%. So those ratios are very, very low compared to other countries. And you can argue many reasons why, such as the childcare, lack of childcare support and so forth. But I believe the fundamental root cause of this what's hampering women's pursuing professional career is actually long working hours at the Japanese companies. And this is Japan, and this is France. And if you compare, so this is the paid work. Japanese men spend more than twice long hours working paid hours. And this unpaid work is basically household chores and child rearing. And, you know, this is by minutes, so 62 minutes, only 1 hour, and less than half of Frenchmen. But if you look at the Japanese females, they are actually spending almost 8 hours combining both paid work and unpaid work. So actually, of course, Japanese men should do more household chores and child care rearing. But if you look at the total hours, both men and women in Japan is spending about 40% more on the combined hours. So if we can shorten the short-term hours, we can not only increase the number of women who are in professional positions, but I also think that we can bring in more non-Japanese, because nobody wants to work such long hours except for the Japanese people. So, I'd like to, this is an important issue, and I really believe that this is important because, but also this could be a challenge for the Japanese companies, because Japanese companies have been very successful in developing a very homogeneous culture, basically made up of Japanese men, and try to change that to bring in more non-Japanese and women would be a big challenge. And I'd like to finish this, and I'd like to continue after.
Thank you, Masako-san. Taking this at a global level, there are data to suggest that despite a 40% participation in the workforce, women only occupy 12% of top leadership and board positions, which itself reflects some of the points that you made. And going back to these long work hours, I think I've always maintained, and at the risk of sounding a bit contentious, then the work day was invented by men to shirk household duties. And I think the more we get them back into the work front, the more we have a more even distribution of power. Now we're going to move on to the second element that we want to discuss in this panel discussion. By the way, diversity, as you know, apart from gender, there's ethnic, national, age-related, and some people also argue sexual orientation related as well. So that there are many different dimensions of diversity that we can talk about. But I want to go on to discuss the impact of diversity on organization structure and behavior. And I'm hoping, Shifun, you'll be able to shed some light on that.
I guess I will talk about sort of the impact perhaps on an organization from three perspectives. One, our sort of relationship that we would have externally when you have a diverse, culture within a company, diverse team, interaction with customers, with vendors. Second point being, the dynamic within the team itself, how it makes us a better employer when you're managing and you have a diverse team, working for you. And thirdly, the impact on leadership and how we should challenge the norm of how we lead our team. So first, from a sort of external perspective, we talked about how quickly the world's changing. If you look at technology change today, it's completely transforming the way we live our lives today, all of us. How, the instant access to information is empowering decision-making at the user level. I'm thinking about my 70-year-old mom. A few years ago, she used to call me about what she should be doing, what brand's good, and, calling her well-traveled daughter. And today, well, ever since, she's got her beloved iPhone, she's WeChatting and WhatsApping her friends, her 60, 70-year-old friends, and getting latest information about what they believe is cool. And she doesn't call me anymore. But, it's transforming how she's thinking about the world. And she's making those decisions herself. So think about, from business perspective, how our customer base is changing rapidly. IT products, for example, or these cool gadgets used to be just boys' toys. It's the men's toys. But if you think about who's buying iPhone and changing iPhone more frequently, you're the women customers. So that's changing the way that businesses need to interact with customers and externally. And having a diverse team means that you're better equipped to be able to be responsive and to be able to develop those intimate relationship and better understanding of what your customers are really looking for. If you look internally within an organization, having a diverse environment, and it is proven that you provide then a more fulfilling environment, a more rewarding environment for learning and development. Because every single thing you do, you need to align, you need to get, you have different perspective offered to you. And what it means is that you're more able then to attract better talent and access a wider pool of talent and retain them. But what's important, what's even more important, is the way you would then have to lead and to manage. And I think it brings completely a different view and perspective to what leadership means. Because for the first time ever, I think, we have to understand that treating people fairly does not mean that you treat everybody equally. And what I mean is, just take the traditional 9-to-5 office job. A mom with 2 kids who has school runs at 7 a.m. and having to do, the pickup at 4 p.m. may prefer to work 7 to 4. Well, a newly graduate whose life is all about work and pubbing after work may prefer to start later and end at 7 p.m. so he could head down to the pub afterwards. But to treat everybody fairly, I expect the same level of commitment and dedication and output from the work, but it does not mean that I expect everybody to start 9 to 5. And, what's really important then is really to have that dialogue and not have the assumption that this is what everybody in my organization wants, but really have that, honest dialogue around what really works for everybody. Long hours at work, is it really necessary? The second aspect is, so that's the flexibility part. But I think what's really important is putting accountability. So how we used to manage from a process perspective, when I have a problem and I throw a problem at someone who has 20, 30 years of experience, that person relies a lot on intuition. He goes out to the pub, have a few drinks, he makes a few phone calls, and because of the richness of his network, he comes back with a perspective. You throw a problem at a 25-year-old, newly graduate, he runs to his computer and he immediately pulls out all the data he can find from a publicly available source, and he runs 300 different algorithms to tell you what their data means. But they may not be very different from a perspective that they offer you or the solution they offer you. But what it means is, you cannot prescribe a way or a specific way of how work should be done. But then you put the accountability in terms of your expectation, from the team, because you want to harness the best of what they do to achieve the best result. So, these two aspects for me is, it's really making us challenge what leadership, it means. And I referred to earlier about the lack of leadership in a diverse environment will create real dysfunctionality. So diversity then becomes a real issue if there's no strong leadership in place. Because when you have such a diverse environment, the job of a leader then is to set very clear goals and direction and stick to the ground and make very tough calls when you're faced with too many options. The issue with diversity is that instead of 3 solutions or even 2, you now end with 10 solutions. And the job of a leader is to really be able to align what is really important and what matters within that. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief. A lot of food for thought. I'm going to pick up on one of the points that you made, which is unbridled diversity can often work to the disadvantage of the company. So we really need to make a business case for greater diversity. And there are lots of corporations which are now indulging in best practices on how do you enhance diversity and then leverage it to the company's advantage. So I'm hoping that to make a business case for greater diversity, I'm going to pick on Sandeep and ask him to talk a bit from his experience about how he's managed to retain and develop diverse workforces.
Thank you very much. I'll do my best. And let me first start by saying I apologize for not having been here 10 or 15 years ago, because I think some of the data you just got are the basis for major opportunities for improvement. To be honest, I think that it's a business case to have diversity, including diversity of gender. And I'm going to try my best to make this point using some data from some real companies. And the only point I want to make from the beginning is that I'm not an academic, I'm a business person, so please don't take me for not having enough evidence and so on. It's only 1,000 people that is the basis for the data, and it's only a few companies. But I think that the points are relevant and hopefully will make sense for you. So, Ilian talked about earlier that Novo Nordisk is #1 on the cover page of Harvard Business Review. And another company next door, Novozymes, is #1 as technology employer in the world. And Milestone, just acquired by Canon, is a leader in surveillance cameras. How come that some of these companies all come from the same little country with 5 million people? I think that we need to look upon diversity in many aspects, and it cannot just be gender. There's a lot of other things in it. And many of these can be detected in what is being phrased key competency indicators, supplementing key performance indicators. So let's look at it, and basically my key point is it seems to work. So it's not proven, it's just indications, but it seems that those data that we got about gender, nationality, and competencies, or the proxy for experience, actually indicate some data that are relevant. On the left side, what you see is a pretty blurred picture because up here you have if something was launched, and here it was, terminated, and here it was launched. And basically, when you look at these data, it doesn't really give any picture. It is a question mark how to interpret it, and at best, you might come to the conclusion that more projects were terminated later. But if we look at the same data on the second slide, then we start seeing something, because here we see that if we have average science experience higher than 3 years, it seems that there's more launch projects compared to terminated projects. And in this way, I think that we have a strong indicator that if we have a diversity in terms of experience, there might be a higher degree of success. So sometimes you can look at this, if you look at it for women, we'll see the same, that in the middle, between 30 and 70% women, you have a higher degree of launches. And the same if we look at the number of nations, 4 or more nations involved in innovation and research projects provides a better result. So all of this, I think, indicate that diversity pays off. And if this is true, I regret that I was not here 15 years ago, because I think Japan is far behind. Look at the audience. Do we have equal representation? No. I think that this is a good example of a country that have fallen behind with a huge potential to catch up. So forgive me for being a bit provocative, but I think that this is really an opportunity for many Japanese companies and maybe Japan as a nation. And today we have His Excellency Ambassador Svane here also. I'm sure he's happy to share with you also if you have any need for data or any more, because there is a lot of opportunities for learning from others. Now, this is just another kind of evidence, I think, for the point that if you look at the project launched in this survey, which is over 10 years, it shows that if there's a higher number than 8 scientists involved in a project, it almost triples the launch rates. So there's a lot of indications, I think, that this works one way or the other. And if we take this and compare this and add it into the whole context of INSEAD, I think it's a strong supporter of what INSEAD is doing and INSEAD is planning to do, which is even more important, because the future is a lot of opportunities, but only for those who are making it a lot more. And on this, I would like to say that I think that it's not only about attracting, it's also about attracting and retaining for the right reasons. And giving a bonus once a year is probably not the right reason why people stay. And you see this on Wall Street, where people leave the day after they get the bonus. I would like to refer back to Sumanta Ghoshal, who was a professor at INSEAD, the late Sumanta Ghoshal, because he invented the notion employability, in my view. And he came up with the idea that in addition to paying a salary and giving people meaningful work, we should give them the opportunity to constantly upgrade their competencies so that they also in the future can get meaningful work. And if we do this, and if we include employability in the way we work, then all diversity kind of makes sense. So it's a business case, diversity pays off, and the way to get the best diversity is maybe to include employability. So the race for talent is on, and the winner takes it all. You don't get half an employee. You either get the best employee or you don't get him or her. And I think the second part is, and maybe also very relevant for many Japanese companies, don't pretend that you can do everything. Do what you do best and link to the rest. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandeep. There is definitely a business case for diversity, but we also heard earlier that at times cultural differences, linguistic barriers can create friction and stymie the development of teamwork rather than spark that cross-fertilization of ideas, which lead to greater innovation and out-of-the-box thinking. So the role of leadership is very important in ensuring that we are able to rein in that element of diversity for the benefit of the corporation. So Onishi-san, I would like to ask you, from your experiences, what is the role of leadership in enhancing those kinds of best practices and making sure that the diversity works to the advantage of the corporation?
Sure. I think before I answer that question, probably we should pose a question. Do we really need diversity? Some of the Japanese company has been so successful just staying on the uniform culture. That certainly helps to reduce the cost of the communication, decision-making process, and such. That has been successful probably 70s, 80s. Then question really comes, is that strategy already doesn't work? That's probably the question we have to ask ourselves. I think if you decided to stay in the certain segments, certain clusters of the business, or maybe certain clusters of the geography, that might be the okay strategy to have. But right now, the environment, especially economy side, is getting so global. Probably having a uniform culture, uniform decision-making process doesn't probably work. Partly because you do not necessarily have all the solution inside, so you have to reach out outside. So that's the cost of having diversity is there if everything stays same and you know what's going to happen next, and you have all solution. But if you in the world where nothing really clear what's going to happen next, and then you really have to have a solution in the future, the diversity really is the best investment you have. Talking about Japanese culture, I think they tend to speak their own language to communicate. Not in the sense of Japanese language, but their own corporate language. And that's the very dangerous phenomenon to see. One of the American company actually creating the group of people who actually doesn't understand their own corporate culture or language. The process goes like this. They hired best and brightest financial background people from the college or from the MBA, and then assign them as a leadership program. Usually run from 2 years to even 5-6 years. And after that, they assign as a corporate audit. So they believe they are the best, and they do not understand the uncoded language and unwritten rule of the corporation. They go into each individual division and then go into the detail, whether this financial decision making sense and such. And that company has been so successful. Partly because that actually set the tone. You can really rely on your own set of decision-making process or set of way of communicating or languages. That's demand the entire organization on the clarity of the purpose, clarity of the decision-making. That actually help the organization stronger and better. So I think bringing diverse group of people, diverse culture is important. But sometimes you choose to create different diverse set of team inside and let them go inside the organization to activate and also demand the organization to behave differently. So that's probably one of the interesting business case we have.
Thank you, Onishi-san. Masako, you have an additional point on that?
I agree with Onishi-san that the diversity really adds value in times of uncertainty because it allows the organization to really cope with the uncertain surprises. And but in addition, I think we should also understand that the diversity itself really leads to better performance, because you probably heard about the Medici effect, that the part of the reason that the Renaissance flourished is because people from different backgrounds, artists and scientists, gathered in the courtroom of Medici family and had an opportunity to interact with each other. And that led to new innovations. And based on my experiences at the university, we also hear a lot that the new discoveries take place when people from different disciplines get together and have ideas. So I think it's very important to come up with the innovations which is necessary for the next generation. We really enhance diversity. And in this regard, I think Japanese companies have a very large challenge because part of the success has been built on a very homogeneous culture and consensus, but that we need to bring in people with the different backgrounds.
Sure. Sandeep?
I just wanted to make the point that I think it's not only a challenge, it's also an opportunity. It's a great opportunity. Imagine how well Toyota and many other companies have been doing despite not getting this right. There's a huge opportunity.
Thank you. And another indication of how diversity works to your advantage, we are right on time with our panel discussion. So having a diverse panel group really enhances efficiency as well. I'm just going to throw out one more question, and that's related to age diversity. We have the boomers, we have the X generation, we have now the millennials. And in the process of globalization, of course, there are lots of corporations which cross their own barriers to go and work in different demographics, and hence face a very different demography as well. What kind of leadership challenges does that pose, especially if I look towards Japan going out into the new emerging markets? We have an aging population, but they are now going to be inventing and innovating for a relatively young population in those global markets. So how is this going to pan out? Anybody?
Well, I think, this is my 6th INSEAD event in November, so I dare to refer back to the second last, which was Thursday, Friday at INSEAD in Singapore about emerging markets. And one of the key points, in my view, was that emerging markets requires totally different strategies. You cannot just repeat what you do in mature markets. You have to balance global and local. And I think local is the word that is being used. And, it also comes to how to manage the people, both your customers, as we heard about, and your employees, but also the interaction between what used to be called the headquarter and the subsidiaries. What in the future is probably going to be something else when we have finally have the transnational organization.
I think when it comes to sort of different level of experience, if we can, and that's what I think, corporations really work very hard on, is how we combine in a potent way the experience, the intuition which I talk about. Because those experience and intuition counts a lot from all the ups and downs that, a more experienced person have been through. How we combine that with a fresh, pair of eyes, with a completely untainted view of the new world, and the agility, the technology. And if we can really harness these two, and what it involves is therefore, in addition to diversity, is an inclusion culture. Because just having diversity without that open mindset, an inclusive mindset, will get us nowhere. And what that means is that at the leadership level, the self-awareness that, how many times have we sat in a meeting? You and I think, let's all be brutally honest with ourselves. We are a diverse bunch. We are from INSEAD, but how many times have you been in a meeting and you think, God, he or she really knows nothing. And how quickly, as someone blah, blah, blah at you dismiss quite naturally, because we're all human. We're all human of familiarity, creatures of familiarity. How quickly we dismiss those, and we challenge ourselves, and we need to challenge ourselves to truly embrace diversity, not from action, huge program perspective, but from a mindset perspective, and that starts with us.
Thank you. This is the time that we open it up to the floor. So this is your opportunity to challenge the wisdom of our panelists. Agree with them, disagree with them, throughout your own questions. Yes, the gentleman there. Do you need a mic?
You'd be better.
Right behind you.
Hi, thank you very much. It was very interesting. I think you guys did a very good case about why diversity matters. and what are some of the pitfalls, you know, of diversity, and how to think about that. But there was one area where I thought you could have spent more time talking, and this is, how do you actually implement it? You know, how do you actually bring about that change? And I was wondering if you guys had, you know, practical advice, you know, best practices, you know, from your previous experiences, and if not, even ideas on how actually you make that change, because this is what I'm interested about.
Sandeep?
Thank you. I'll be more than happy to talk about this. I think that the first thing we have to be open about is that there's a new model coming in. And the new model is that we have to look at the vision, mission, values, and strategy and translate this into what competences are needed for the future. Then we have to trust people and do self-assessment. If we do this, and if we then use objective criteria to select who's going to be involved in what, and how can we get the best team together, we are on the right track. And some companies are doing it. This is not your theory. The leading companies are doing this today. And you'll see this coming in very fast. And I guess that for some of you in the room, if you think about how you do things, this might be different from what you do today.
Masako-san?
Well, first of all, commitment from the leader or top is very, very important, because bringing in minority people is very, very difficult for those people who are brought in themselves. And many experiences of multinational corporations indicate that you need a critical mass for the minorities to survive, and it's typically 30%. So when you bring in non-Japanese or women or other people with other backgrounds as a minority, make sure that they're just alone and alienated. So that's very important. And I point about inclusion. Many of us are very, very ignorant about unconscious bias. I think Japan is very low in gender diversity, but I think many leaders of large Japanese corporations are very aware of the importance of gender diversity, and yet they have not been able to change that. And that's because all of us are victims of the unconscious bias. So we have to get training on those things, be aware, and then really create inclusive culture. Just bring in those things is not enough.
Jifun, would you like to add something to it?
Yes. Can I just share what Linda is doing? Because this is a really important topic for us. Certainly, I think from senior commitment, leadership commitment perspective, from the board, from CEO directly himself, at the APEC level, our board member are passionate about this agenda. But it's not just about talking about it. It's making some really concrete steps, putting women in senior leadership, creating peer teams, to really demonstrate why, and that's why it matters. So concrete action. But secondly, I think if, in fact, for an organization, diversity is on the strategic agenda, then you need to treat this like you would of any business strategic agenda. And so in Asia Pacific, we have a council, a diversity and inclusion council, that is formed of business unit representatives, that sets the vision, but more importantly, the roadmap towards getting there, setting targets, for example. And then you have a publicity group, someone who's really responsible for publicity, creating that awareness, constantly, raising that in the front of, or the organization. And then once you have that momentum, through a very deliberate structure in place, we have a dedicated person who is responsible for facilitating that best practice across the region, to ensure that this is not just a once a month email that goes out because, oh God, this is time for another email. But more importantly, the third very important step is how you ingrain that, and that becomes a deep-rooted value. Just like diversity is the value of INSEAD, it becomes a part, an integrated part of how we conduct ourselves and our business, the same level as you would with ethics, honesty, integrity, and so would diversity be. But it is a long journey. You don't get there over time.
I think I agree with her. Talking about GE practice, it just not diversity, just not throwing the different culture, different ages and such in the one box and see what's going to happen. It's not the case. On the same time, the corporate have to pay or actually create core value, which you never compromise on that. I mean, 2, 3, 4 points. Inclusiveness is pretty common practice, but this is really the value you want to create. Probably not 10, but 3, 4, 5. And that's something actually set a stage across a different diverse group of people. And that actually helped GE to acquire some other company, but reach out their culture and make them be part of our culture. So the creating common core value is very, very important first step, and probably the last step to be successful to embracing different inclusive culture.
Thank you. I think to summarize, the nuts and bolts of enhancing diversity really come at 2 levels. One is at the HR level, in the recruitment policies, in the development of staff policies, and in the retention of the workforce. And leadership plays a role in setting the vision, making it part of the corporate DNA, but also having metrics to track whether you are enhancing diversity and leveraging it to your company's advantage. And these include attrition rates, exit interviews, all those things that we learn in good business schools. And of course, you start recruiting from institutions such as INSEAD to make sure that you do have a truly diverse workforce. Next question. Okay, there's one here, Santoshi, and then one at the back. And third number here.
Thanks for the panel for the views. I'm going to go a little bit in the opposite direction. And we talk about diversity and how it can help, et cetera, and how it brings benefit. I can see lots of potential pitfalls going forward, right? Because we put so much effort on highlighting it. What about the risks of putting so much emphasis on diversity? We've seen many examples of, let's say, for example, affirmative action, right, in many places around the world, which have gone the wrong way around. So what are the views around the risks of highlighting diversity, and what are the thoughts around how to handle them so that we can have the right thing here?
Thank you, Santoshi. Sandeep, you'd like to take that?
First of all, I think you're absolutely right that we should highlight there's a risk, and we should be sure that we also know how to manage the risk. Because obviously, whenever you start doing things differently, there's a risk. So you need contingency plans. You also need to have monitoring systems so that you can monitor whether it works or not. And if it doesn't, as we've been talking about, it requires leadership. And it seems that leadership acts better if there's some kind of data. So I would suggest that the way to manage this risk, as Ilian also talked about in the morning, be analytical, make sure that we have sufficient data. And if things go wrong, then obviously we need to change and adjust.
In the interest of time, we'll go on to the next question. The gentleman at the back.
Hello, my name is Primoz. I work for a Western multinational in Tokyo. I had a question on age diversity in Japan. As the population is aging, our workforces are aging. Because of the seniority pay system, they are becoming more and more expensive. What is becoming very popular now in a decreasing market or in a downturn is to rejuvenate organizations to bring down cost. And it seems that there are these one-off changes to age structures in Japanese corporations. So my question was how to enable a systemic rejuvenation of corporations and of business units in Japan, if you had any best practices on that, and also how to give young people more voice in decision-making in the Japanese corporate environment. Thank you.
Who would like to take that? Masako.
I think Japanese companies have particular challenge in coping with this issue you just raised, because more and more companies are bringing in senior people to make up the labor shortage. which limits the opportunities for younger people. And because of the seniority culture and the system, it's very difficult for young people to really develop and do what he or she is capable of. And the only solution I can think of is to really have a very flexible, substantive evaluation system where people are evaluated based on the merits rather than the age. And in that regard, I actually think that the bringing in non-Japanese or women or other people, different background is very, very helpful. I heard at the Matsushita back in when Mr. Nakamura was president, he was trying to promote women. So he asked the HR division to really carefully review their HR policy for promotion and evaluation. So they had to really set very objective criteria because that was the only way to evaluate people from different backgrounds. And that had effect of surprisingly promoting younger people. Because before, unconsciously, people are promoting men primarily based on kind of seniority or kind of experience. But the reviewing, bringing diversity forced the company to set more objective criteria for promotion. So I think that's the only way. And really, I think culturally bringing in non-Japanese or women or people with different backgrounds who question the existing system would help.
Thank you, Masako-san. I think you bring up a very important point. We talk about diversity to enhance competency, not to sacrifice competency. So merit is very important in the discussion on diversity. The gentleman right there.
My name is Ichiro Miyake. I manage one of US-based rating agencies since 2 years. And one of the surprises when I start this business, this position, is that over 50% of Japan management committee members are women. That was a huge surprise for me because, you know, I've been in Citibank, Citigroup for 15 years. Then I managed MetLife, US MetLife business Japan. I managed German Allianz business in Japan. But I don't see any diversity in their senior management. You know, exceptions are those so-called R positions like HR, PR, CSR, even risk. You know, for me, that's a kind of excuse position. And then, you know, when I, excuse me my language, but you know, when I look at, you know, the so-called rating criteria, you know, we have hundreds of criteria, each of which got numbers of points to evaluate for creditworthiness. But, you know, I try to, you know, think about, but there is zero point to evaluate diversity in order to, you know, evaluate creditworthiness. So now I doubt if, you know, those management really convinced that, you know, diversity enhance corporate value or creditworthiness. You know, I personally very much, you know, convinced because, you know, the business I manage in Japan works quite well. So, you know, I just want to listen to you guys, you know, if you were convinced by the statement that, you know, diversity enhance corporate value. If you think yes, can you raise your hand? Okay, you know, I think this is kind of majority. But, you know, but at least, you know, those major corporate, global corporate, like Citibank, Citigroup, MetLife, Allianz, even today, I believe, quite limited diversity in terms of gender on senior management, top management, I mean, executive committee member. So, you know, still I'm wondering why. I don't have any clear answer. So, you know, if you guys have any suggestion, very much appreciated.
Who would like to take that one? Sandeep.
I know time is up, so I'll do it very brief. I think there's one phrase that might cover it. Satisfactory underperformance. Simply that some companies tend to see what they do as satisfactory because they have a short-term performance which is okay, but it's actually satisfactory underperformance because they could do even better if they did differently. So I think this term may be my last word on this.
So I see a big red sign saying, stop, time's up. Is that true? Or can we take one more question? I want to hear from the ladies in the room, the few.
Actually, it's a trade-off. Either we stop here and we have 1 hour and 15 minutes for the lunch, or we can extend a little bit.
I think I'll wrap up. I don't want to stand between everybody and lunch.
Very good. Thank you very much, Satya.
So, ladies and gentlemen, this morning we heard about globalization of businesses and how it's creating a more sophisticated, a more complex, and a more competitive environment. And the development of new ideas really requires a diverse workforce to enable the company to stay ahead of the curve, to drive innovation, to foster creativity, to guide business practices, to ensure that the company's products and services are in line with the regions and the demographics of the countries in which they operate. Now, we're going to be talking about innovation a bit later on after lunch. So we'll come back for that discussion. But I hope that what we've managed to do in this short session is to convince you that going from globalization to creativity and innovation, diversity has a very important element to play in that value proposition. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you to the panelists, and we'll see you after lunch.